Azlaroc Tales by Fred Saberhagen. The short stories you're about to hear were reworked into a novel called The Veils of Azlaroc 2 years after their release. The first, Beneath the Hills of Azlaroc, was only ever published in the spring 1976 issue of Roger Elwood's short-lived Odyssey magazine. A follow-up story set in the same universe appeared in August of the same year, entitled To Mark the Year on Azlaroc. It was republished multiple times, initially appearing in the Science Fiction Discoveries anthology edited by Carol and Frederik Pohl, then in a collection of the author's stories called Earth Descended in 1981, in issue number 96 of a Yugoslav magazine called Sirius in 1984, and another collection of the author's works called Of Berserkers, Swords, and Vampires, a Saberhagen Retrospective in 2009. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Beneath the Hills of Azlaroc. His name was Francisco Sorokin, and he had walked on the surface of a neutron star. Or so he said when he reappeared in the nameless city, the only place that could be called a city on the strange world of Azlaroc. "You expect anyone to believe that?" Militus Milbray scoffed. He recognized Sorokin, knew him slightly, felt contempt for him as a harmless braggart and a vagabond, a quack anchorite who spent about half his time in the remote mathematical deserts of the world and the other half in town convincing tourists that he was a mysterious and romantic figure. It was quite possibly true that he knew more about the deserts than did any other man. Sorokin gave a slight "I don't care if you believe me or not" gesture, the equivalent of a shrug, and stood before a slab of polished wood imported at great cost, pondering the bartender's recent automatic query as to what he would like to have. At the moment, he and Milbray were the tavern's only customers. The gesture of indifference had been not very convincing, Milbray thought. He would have expected that a man like Sorokin could do better. Milbray studied the other's face, which he was able to do readily enough, because they were near contemporaries on Azlaroc, each of them having settled here about 50 years ago. "Brandy, year 475, Milbray ordered. The bartender was no machine, but a man who evidently liked the work, and like most human bartenders, a recent settler. As a comparative newcomer, he could of course converse more readily with the tourists who made up a large part of his trade. This year's tourists, whom Milbray saw through about 50 veils, were blurred enough to him to make recognition of facial features difficult. "Sorry, sir, we seem to be out. We're getting a liquor shipment from recycling in about 8 hours. So if you'd care to try tonight or tomorrow... Meanwhile, I can offer 476. "Bah, I have no urge to swallow silk just to be sociable. My bloodstream cries for booze." Of course, only one veil lay between 475 and 476, but to a stomach of the wrong year group, the stuff would be completely inert. "I'll take a shot of that 476. My very year." Sorokin turned around, leaning with his elbows on the bar, looking somehow bigger and more formidable than before. "Do you don't believe me? Well, I suppose I've cried wolf far too often." A single point of light from the one veil that lay between them made a small sparkle at his elbow. "Wolf?" "An old story." Sorokin looked off into space. "This performance is getting better," Milbray thought to himself. "What have you for 475? He asked the bartender. The man tapped a button for an inventory readout. Whiskey, bang, schnapps, rum, something with rum in it. Very cold. Hoping for amusement, Milbray looked back at Sorokin and made his own expression one of interest, with just the right amount of doubt. "So, tell me about walking on the neutron star." Sorokin smacked his lips over his brandy of 476. "Still tastes good. I'll tell you a first name, and then perhaps you'll be willing to believe the rest." An old settler passed, a man or woman from hundreds of years ago, so far warped by hundreds of veils from Sorokin's and Milbray's shared reality that he, or she, was little more than a drift of visible vibrations in the air, whose zone of passage included the corner of Milbray's modern table without in the least disturbing the simultaneous arrival of his rum drink. An old settler bartender, or more probably a machine of that era, came in the form of a similar blur to take his order across the ancient, polished wood. No questions of communication with the three men already there. From their viewpoint, no one had really entered. "A name?" Milbray maintained his cultivated expression, but suddenly he thought he knew the name. It was the beginning of an awesome understanding. More people were coming into the tavern now, tourists or recent settlers, laughing. Their voices were slurred in Milbray's ears, but still intelligible. "Ramachandra," said Sorokin, and though he had not spoken the name loudly, the happy group who had just entered were silent instantly. The contemporaneous bartender raised his head and then ceased to move, and all of them for a moment were quiet as statuary. It had been nearly an Azlarocian year earlier, one fewer veil draped upon them all, when Sorokin with his own hands had given the box to Ramachandra. It was a small black rhomboid box with sides of unequal size, and Sorokin had clung to it like a fanatic while passing secretaries, bodyguards, and functionaries of unknown function that the wealthy recluse had gathered about himself. Sorokin had sent word of his find ahead, and when he finally confronted Ramachandra himself in one of the city's typical underground apartments, the potentate leaned forward in his throne-like chair, said, "Well?" and held out his hand. Half a dozen others had recently made the same gesture, almost as imperiously, but in vain. This time, Sorokin honored it, handing over the heavy black metal case, which was just about big enough to have contained a human heart or brain. One of the many chamberlains nearby made a disgusted sound as soon as he got a good look at the box. "Not even the right size or shape. Is it even a message carrier?" Ramachandra raised 3 imperious fingers. "Beside the distorted nameplate on this device is a mark that seems identical to one I put secretly on each unit that we sent out with the robots. Callisto, come here and look. Could the very shape of the box have been changed? I see no sign that it's been crushed." The woman called Callisto was either a tourist or a very new settler, for the details of her face and garments were somewhat blurred in Sorokin's vision by his veils, while Ramachandra himself seemed to belong to Sorokin's own year group of settlers, or to one very near to it in time, for they could behold each other with perfect clarity. Callisto was tall, and like most of the people to be seen on Azlaroc, of youthful bearing but indeterminate age. Now she was looking closely at the box as Ramachandra continued to turn it over in his brown, bejeweled, and powerful-seeming hands. "Sir," she said, finally, "I had not foreseen that its very shape might change, that it might carry back some residual alteration in the space within its atoms or its molecules, but I cannot say that such a change should be impossible." She lifted black, veil-blurred eyes to Sorokin. "Where did you find this thing?" "Along the peak of Ruler Ridge, some 20 or 22 kilometers to the south of here." "Which side of the ridge, and how near the top?" Callisto asked him sharply. "The east side, toward the city, milady." There was some mockery, perhaps, in the honorific form of address, and it was embedded in the ground not half a meter from the top. Just about half of the box was showing, fortunately, with the little nameplate clear. "Finder, please return to Ramachandra himself cut in. "They tell me you are always finding or reporting mysterious things out in the desert. Have you reported this to anyone else?" "I have not. As for my finding and seeing and knowing other things out there, why, I suppose I'm there more than anyone else, except perhaps some of the original settlers." "Are you amenable to being hired?" the man on the throne chair asked. He named a sum that was half again as much as most jobs paid, "plus food and quarters here in my suite, as long as you're employed, which will be for an indefinite period." "My duties?" "Consultant on the desert and its topography and its wonders, shall we say?" Ramachandra's voice was dry. "I shall require that you remain usually in my suite and communicate with the outside only as I direct while you are in my employ. Can you start at once?" Sorokin appeared to take thought. "I can." "Good. Now let's see what our message carrier holds." One of Ramachandra's male aides was already leading a machine into the room. At a nod from his employer, he tapped out on its input, "Damaged recorder, message carrier to be read." And then he took the black device from Ramachandra's hand and gave it to the hand-like grippers of the machine. "Everyone out of the room, please." Ramachandra had raised his voice slightly. "Except you, Callisto. I'll want your opinion." His eyes swiveled to Sorokin. "And you stay too. If this thing proves not to be authentic, I'll want you right on hand." "For what?" Sorokin wondered uneasily. He had heard some strange stories about Ramachandra, who was a little-known man among Azlaroc's small, permanent population, though he had been a settler here now for some 50 years. There were hints of violence in the stories, and more than hints of eccentricity, but Sorokin made no protest now, only took a seat at the powerful man's right hand, while Callisto sat just as formally at his left. The machine was now ready to display the contents of the message carrier, and it dimmed the ambient lighting and began to project a hologram into the middle of the room. The indoor space faced by the three seated people seemed to disappear, and they saw before them the desert, utterly lifeless. Not pure yellow, as was the desert immediately surrounding the city, nor mottled gold and pink, as on the high land of Ruler Ridge, but pale orange and mauve, as Sorokin had often seen it in the depression on the city's other side. 10 or 12,000 kilometers from the city in that direction, the land began to run under black sky, the sky of darkness, and into the uninhabitable zone. Two people, Ramachandra and Callisto, were foreground in the hologram, standing a few paces from the camera that had recorded it, and looking toward the camera, which was evidently supported by some person. No, Ramachandra had mentioned robots, hadn't he? That was sinking slowly into the ground. With their eyes fixed studiously on a point near Sorokin, the images of Callisto and Ramachandra slid slowly upward, and the orange and mauve surface of the world rose too. Beginning in the extreme foreground of the image and zigzagging off between mathematical hills, to vanish at last in the far background beneath the black sky zone, ran what might, on some more ordinary world, have been taken for a dried-out watercourse. On some planet where it could rain and conditions were halfway reasonable for men to dwell, or even on some world where clouds dripped liquid lead to burn out channels in the landscape, the great crack might have been taken for a narrow, desiccated gully. But on mild Azlaroc it never rained, not even liquid lead. This purple-bottomed ditch into which the robot sank, by all the veils, Sorokin hoped it was a robot and not a human, was made not by erosion but by subduction, the slow infolding of the outer surface of the world down into unexplored depths beneath. Men had not dug too deeply here, because they feared to break a balance of natural forces. Azlaroc was not a planet, and what lay beneath its crust was no mere molten rock. This world had a unique constitution, containing types of matter unknown elsewhere. It had a star-like mass, but zones of natural gravity inversion that had made partial human colonization possible, and it whirled through space in an intricate orbital dance with a fluid core-type pulsar and a small black hole. Even the pulsar was peculiar, having a rotation period of almost 4 seconds. So Azlaroc was a strange enough world for anyone. Even without the veils that yearly formed and fell from space. The robot, assuming it to be about the size and shape of a man, was now about waist-deep in the subduction trench. On Earth and elsewhere, such trenches existed in the ocean bottoms, infolding rock and other matter from the sea floors into the planet's mantle, and incidentally forming an impassable barrier to the spread of plant life along the bottom. On Earth, some 10 centimeters of surface per year might be carried into the depths, with approximately the same amount being simultaneously evolved from sub-oceanic ridges. On Azlaroc, the analogous process seemed capable of consuming, at least in some zones of rapid action, 10 centimeters or more of surface per minute. Sorokin, in his wanderings, had sometimes seen some of the smaller geometric solids that were the landscape's natural features, borne down into the trenches and out of sight. Just as the robot making the recording was now about to go. Now the recorder itself was on the very bottom of the trench, level with the purple floor that looked solid and yet not. For a moment longer, Ramachandra's and Callisto's eyes looking down at it could be seen, and beyond their imaged heads, the yellowish sky that was not a sky of Azlaroc, with a tall, asymptomatic pinnacle of landscape breaking off in radiant fire against it at an altitude of 100 meters or so. And then the hologram went dark with the absolute blackness of underground. Dark, save for a digital display of hours and minutes, which was evidently generated within the recorder itself, and now appeared projected near the floor of the room in which the 3 people watched. The display was running up from a 0 hour, minute, and second that had evidently been set as the time when the carrier machine began its descent into the trench. Ramachandra's voice in the darkened room was tense as he leaned forward to make an adjustment to the machine. "We'll speed it up a little. No telling how long this phase of darkness lasts." The digital chronometer figures blurred into a faster flow. 1 hour. 2. 3. Why shouldn't the darkness last the whole time the camera's underground? Sorokin asked. He had gotten himself involved in this now, for better or worse, and he decided he had better learn all he could of what was going on. I mean, I assume this recorder was somehow carried through the interior of the world and brought up again by natural forces at Ruler Ridge. How long ago did you put it into the trench? Ramachandra was leaning forward in his throne-like chair, staring absorbedly into the darkness of the hologram, and did not answer. "About 1 year," said Callisto abstractedly. Sorokin had almost expected the answer, having come to note the same periodicity in all sorts of apparently unrelated Azlarocian events. Years elsewhere might be based on some seasonal or astronomical cycle of little importance to society, or on the more borrowed standard year of Earth. But systemic years here, each marked by the falling of its veil from space, were a central fact of human life. Callisto went on. "We put down more than 20 recorders in all, at different points along different subduction trenches. This is the first to be recovered, and I rather suspect it may also be the last." "Why?" Sorokin asked. In the hologram there was still only darkness, accented rather than relieved by the flicker of time. 120 days now on the chronometer, 121, and by the signals that the watching eye and brain began to generate within themselves. "I mean, I get the impression that this isn't an ordinary research project, and... Well, it's Dr. Callisto, isn't it? Haven't you been involved in physics research on Azlaroc for some time? I've seen or heard your name in that connection, now that I think about it." She looked at him more closely than before. "Yes, I have been involved in such research, and you're also right that this is something a little different." Ramachandra had reached out again to slow the machine, reverse it briefly, and now with a scowl, he was letting it run forward again, somewhat more slowly this time. "Thought I saw something there, but no. This is engineering, Mr. Sorokin. We're going to achieve something specific, aside from any gain of knowledge." "What are we out to achieve, Mr. Ramachandra?" The other man shifted his position, but remained intent on the hologram and did not look round as he spoke. "I intend to leave Azlaroc." For a moment, Sorokin thought that the other was saying euphemistically that he was soon to die. Settlers spoke of leaving Azlaroc in that sense when they spoke of it at all, but death could be easily managed without so straining one's eyes after stray gleams of enlightenment issuing from very strangely mangled and very expensive recorders, and this was not a man for euphemisms. "But you're a settler here," Sorokin said, as he thought, reasonably enough. It had been written of one of the old king capitalists of Earth that facing his stare was like standing in the path of an oncoming locomotive. Locomotives, transport devices of the time, had evidently been, like some of the men who owned them, exceedingly powerful and very crudely controlled, ready to push through human flesh as indifferently as air. Sorokin was reminded of this now when Ramachandra stopped the machine momentarily and turned to give him a full glance. "I settled here by free choice some 49 years ago, Mr. Sorokin, and now it is my equally free choice to leave." Sorokin could only look at him dumbly. 49 of the impenetrable Veils of Azlaroc were bound around the atoms of this man's body, and now he had decided to depart. Even if there had been only a single veil to hold him down, not all the power of all the engines ever built by man could lift a single atom of his body free. In the hologram, the images of bright numbers were poised in darkness. "Mr. Sorokin, since you are going to be working for me, let me make sure you understand me, as Dr. Callisto here has come to do." Ramachandra gestured economically toward a corner of the room where a set of carved pieces waited on a mosaic table. "We are playing chess. You tell me it is impossible for me to move my pawn from the second rank back to the first, and I have no choice but to agree, since I have bound myself to abide by the rules of chess. Now, it is a common misconception that leaving Azlaroc after getting caught under a veil is impossible in the same sense as is moving one's pawn backward. It is not, though of course it has never yet been accomplished. I, for one, have not agreed to any such rule. With the air of one who has made a point to his own complete satisfaction, he turned back to his machine and started the numbers piling up again. Sorokin raised his eyes to Callisto's. The look she returned refused any agreement that her employer was mad. Sorokin asked them both, "Do you expect that this recorder will give you some clue toward getting through the veils?" The others exchanged a quick look. "Getting through them in the usual sense may not be necessary," said Ramachandra. "Have you ever studied the way in which the veils contract about this world?" Before he could reply, Sorokin's eyes were dazzled by a burst of blue-white radiance from the hologram. The projector would of course create no image of an intensity injurious to human eyes, but the blurred brightness of this one suggested that its original might well have been of such power. There was no longer any up or down perceptible in the image, which was of layers of blue and white in many shadings and combinations, layers and stripes of light and seeming fire that riffled past first horizontally and then diagonally as the robot, or whatever was left of it, changed attitudes during its speeding passage through what? What medium was it traversing now, at some unknown depth beneath the habitable zone? Azlaroc was as round as a planet or a star, and beneath its cloudy pseudo-sky, which was really the upper boundary of a thin but stable region of gravity inversion, it had greater habitable area by far than Earth. Its surface was warmed gently by internal heat, lighted by harmless radiation that several causes splashed across the seeming sky, and covered by air and moisture that men with their elegant machinery had generated for themselves and continued to recycle as required. After a veil fell, the next thing men had to do was produce new air and water for the next season's tourists. Otherwise, those coming down would have quickly died amid air of ample pressure, as each atom of the air of other years was bound unusably inside its portion of that year's veil. The partial pressures of the various coexisting atmospheres never added up to more than unity. The same effect that made settlers warp farther from present reality with every year that passed. Each veil that fell was even more marked at the molecular and atomic levels. Sorokin had seen, from time to time and with no particular interest, scientists' descriptions of their careful probings into Azlaroc's mysterious interior. Jargony recitals of numbers and pressures and phases, densities and more numbers and relativistic effects, and still more numbers and mathematics, with suggestions that space near the core of Azlaroc might connect directly somehow with space at the crystalline surface of the companion pulsar. This fact, or possibility of course, had some connection with the veils. The famed Veils of Azlaroc were formed out of material that the triple system gathered to itself as it swung on its way through space. They were the stuff between the stars, worked on by the unimaginable gravitation and radiation, the electric and magnetic fields that obtained within the belts of space that all ships had to avoid when traveling within this system. Once every systemic year, a veil of this transformed matter fell on Azlaroc. The first veil that men ever saw took an exploring party, who thus became the first old settlers, by surprise. They saw it as a net of gossamer that fell toward them from a sky gone mad. After discovering that they could not leave, they discovered that life here was not uncomfortable, and healthy life was considerably prolonged. Since that time, some thousands of other settlers had come voluntarily. Sorokin had seen the scientists' estimates that about 40 million of the impervious, indestructible veils had fallen on Azlaroc and made themselves part of its fabric, since the unique triple system had reached its present, apparently stable state. 40 million years. Not long on the timescale of astronomy, but imagine 40 million of those veils all gathered somewhere. The speeding blue stripes of the hologram ran through a complex sequence of change in which they first narrowed, then widened out again, before contracting abruptly into a singularity of darkness that exploded outward into light, this time the bold glory of a star-filled universe. By all the veils! Sorokin found that he was standing, his hand clutching as if instinctively toward Ramachandra, who brushed its irritation from him. Ramachandra had stopped time in the hologram, frozen its action. 187 days after going down into the subduction zone, the recorder had somehow emerged among the stars, whose splendid images now filled the room. Only after staring at the scene before him for a few moments did Sorokin make out that the stars in its lower half formed a slightly blurred mirror image of those above, as if reflected in a frozen ocean of great smoothness. And all the stars were bluer than one would have expected a random selection of the galaxy to appear, as if these were being viewed from the bottom of some steep gravitational well. I thought there was nowhere on Azlaroc from which one could see... Sorokin sat down again and let the foolish words trail off. He knew there could be no such view from any point on Azlaroc. Ramachandra reached to push the speed control of the machine up to a real-time pace. At once, all the depicted stars began to move, blurring into streaks with the speed at which they rose and set. Each star moved from horizon to horizon in less than 2 seconds, while its image simultaneously tracked across the unbelievable mirror-like plane below, and the whole scene in its entirety was jumping, pulsing at about 1/3 the speed of a calm human heart. The innumerable speed-streaked star images by which the plane was visible all jumped in unison with every pulse, the pulses being timed to coincide with the pulsar, then the neutron star. It recorded this scene from the pulsar's surface. But wait, no, that's impossible, my friend. Huh? Hey? It was the first time Sorokin had seen the big man smile. Ramachandra was elated now. He stopped the action in the hologram, reversed it, ran it forward slowly from the point of the recorder's entry onto the pulsar's surface, savoring every moment. Sorokin had the feeling that he was the one who was being swindled here. Shown a concocted show, gotten to believe in the unbelievable. But why should they take such pains to fool him? No, the recorder could not possibly have been planted out there in the wilderness for him to find. It had been half buried in the matter of the Azlarocian surface, and no one had known that he was going that way. But it was far more preposterous that the recorder could have snugly and smugly come to rest in a field of 100 billion gravities, where not even an atom could remain intact. First, the gross structure of any kind of matter would be whisked away, as if by some magician's gesture, and then the relatively fragile electron orbits would be bent in and collapsed, and then the nuclei themselves. From weak to strong, all the orders of physics bowing down in turn before the great god gravity. Electrons mashed brutally into positive nucleons, nothing left but the neutron soup that made a neutron star, and that could still hold against 100 billion gravities in this last stand before the ultimate collapse, the ultimate abyss. What was left was a star, if one could call it that, maybe 10 kilometers in diameter, with maybe the mass of the sun, radiating very little in the visible part of the spectrum, but an avalanche of radio waves and X-rays and other wavelengths in its furious searchlight beam that swept and pulsed with its rotation. Take up a cubic centimeter of its solid surface, if you can dig up what has some billions of times the strength of steel. Lift it on your thumbnail. Yes, do that. Hundreds of millions of tons. Drop it off your imaginary thumbnail on the surface of the earth, and it will fall all the way through the hard solid earth like a rock through a cloud of thin vapor, and then fall back again toward the center. Yet the recorder, whatever it had been, had obviously survived, though its attendant robot had been lost. Ramachandra stopped the action again. "Diaphaneity reading?" he snapped. Callisto was peering at the hologram through another instrument. "Impossible to get a good one," she answered, her voice tense and at the same time abstracted. "We've got to be looking out onto that surface through the veils. All the veils. Damn near 40 million of them. Nothing breaks them, but they can be stretched. And the recorders that didn't come back, some of them may have gotten out." "Mr. Ramachandra," Dr. Callisto straightened, "I must in all conscience tell you I think it is far more likely that the other recorders were simply lost, destroyed somewhere between here and the pulsar's surface. The second most likely possibility, in my opinion, is that they reached the surface of the pulsar and were not protected by the veils, as this one seems to have been. Remember, 10 to the 11th standard gravities, approximately. And is there a third possibility? Have you calculated that far? All right, yes, of course. I have as yet found no evidence that your theory is impossible. All the Veils of Azlaroc were evidently shielding this recorder when it reached the pulsar's surface, and they might be enough to protect a man as well. It is still my opinion that the veils cannot be pierced by any matter or broken by any force." "Excuse me," Sorokin put in, "but in that case I do not see what all this has to do with getting a man out from under them." Callisto's gaze shifted to him. "Have you studied topology, Mr. Sorokin? In the field of—" "Don't bury him in technicalities," interrupted Ramachandra. "Sorokin, I asked you before if you know how the veils fall. What I meant was this. There is some disagreement among authorities, but it seems at least probable that now and again a veil falls in a looped manner, something like a sheet thrown carelessly upon a bed. In a sense, we are still under it, but actually its outer surface, folded around, is what touches us. Topologically, we are still outside it. I think the veil of 476, your year and mine, fell in that manner. If that is so, it can be mathematically shown that all the people of our particular year group are still outside it." Sorokin knew a strange hollow feeling. "Then we might be able to leave. If we can locate the folding of the veil and go around it." Until this very moment, Sorokin had thought himself contented here in self-imposed imprisonment. Now? "But what of all the other veils that have fallen on us since our first year?" "You will be outside those, too," Callisto said, "if you are really outside your first year's veil and can get around its folded edge." "And where will the edge be?" "Perhaps somewhere just underground, almost in reach, perhaps on the surface of the neutron star, perhaps in the black hole. Sorokin blinked. If he could believe that the recorder had survived the pulsar's surface, why should he not swallow any other scientific incredibility? But, viewing matters the other way, he might do better to reject the recorder's evidence if it required him to accept the proposition he now spoke aloud. One end of an object is here, and the other end there? One end inside a black hole and the other out? If the Veils of Azlaroc are objects, yes. Ramachandra was getting his locomotive look again. I tell you, men need not quail before the seemingly infinite powers that oppose them. How does a mathematician manipulate an infinite number? He turned his gaze briefly on Callisto. Pick up another infinite number and beat it over the head with that. Force it into the shape you want, right? Her attitude seemed to say that she did not necessarily agree, but neither was she going to argue. All right, don't answer. But stripped of your scientist's legalistic precision, that's what it all comes down to. I know I'm dealing with physical reality here, not some mathematician's invention. But the principle's the same. If I can't generate the power I need to pull me free from Azlaroc, I'll put a harness on a greater power to do it. The matter settled, not that it had ever been in doubt. He turned back to the hologram. After some 11 minutes on the surface of the neutron star, during which time it seemed to make several shifts at instantaneous speed to different locations on the surface, with each shift the star streaks and their reflections changing angles in the black, glistening mirror below, the recorder was somehow sucked back into the dark portal in space from which it had emerged, and thence back to the racing bands of light. Some 370 standard days after it had left, it was back on the surface of Azlaroc. Its eye positioner still functioned phototropically, and when Sorokin came into sight, its eye was above ground, and it centered the hologram on him. By that time, it was some 50 or 60 centimeters down from the top of Ruler Ridge. I'm going, then. I'm going to take the chance. Ramachandra, with a slap of his hand, shut off the hologram, and the room's lights restored themselves to normal. I intend to view the rest of this later, Sorokin, to see if you really brought the device straight to me, as you said. For the moment, I'll assume you did, and ask you a question. Are you coming with me, away from Azlaroc and back to the great world? Down into that subduction tunnel? Across the neutron star, looking for a folding in that veil, just to see if we can rejoin the aging universe? And if we don't find the folding on the pulsar, I suppose we'll look into the black hole as well. How are we going to recognize a fold in the veil if we should come upon it? To answer your last objection first, we'll have some specialized instruments along. And if we locate the edge of the fold, no matter where, we should be able to stretch it back with us into that space of blue light bands from which an exit into normal space can be arranged. To answer your other questions, yes, yes, and yes. Add another yes if I have left one out. Look, here. With a vast gesture, he seemed to scatter machines and hired scientists out of his way, and draw Sorokin into a close conference above the surface of a small table. You and I are year-mates here, so one of us can go exactly where the other goes. As far as veils are concerned, just coincidence? At this stage in my life, I doubt if such thing exists in a pure form, where human beings are concerned at any rate. Two people going will have a better chance than one of overcoming unforeseen obstacles. Besides, there is another reason why I don't want to go alone. Will I come with you? Why, it seems insane, but yes. Ever since the chance of leaving Azlaroc had acquired some reality, however tenuous, Sorokin had the feeling that his own life was passing through a singularity, a condition where the old laws failed to hold, into a new stage where nothing was quite what it had been. Now he saw with bitter clarity that a man who spent his time roaming deserts and trying to be an adventurer had made a grave mistake to settle on all but changeless Azlaroc. He wanted to be an adventurer, but did he really want adventures? Already he perceived the difference. Later the perception would be much more forcible. He had surprised Ramachandra with his answer, stilled the locomotive for the moment. "Fine," was all that Ramachandra said, and then reached out to shake his hand. They had the money to hire the best workshops and men available from all the year groups on the world, and the suits of armor were got ready just in time. Ramachandra wanted to begin his attempt before the next veil fell, as Callisto's calculations showed that their chances would be at least marginally improved thereby. A ship was kept waiting to carry her off-world at once, out of the Veil's path, should it begin to fall prematurely, as sometimes happened at this season. She had no intention of being trapped. Their custom-built armor, as Ramachandra explained, was not to help them survive the neutron star, against the powers of which they could hope for no help, save that which the Veils themselves might give, and only partially was the armor meant to help them during their passage through Azlaroc's solid underground. It had to do that, of course, keep them uncrushed and at a reasonable temperature, and supplied with air and water while the inner layers of the world hugged them at a few thousand tons per square centimeter of the armor's surface. But also, the suits would have to see them through their hoped-for emergence into space, free of veils and at some planetary distance between Azlaroc and the pulsar, and of course outside the black hole's lethal Schwarzschild radius. In space, the armor must be proof against terrible onslaughts of radiation, and each suit would act as a miniature spaceship to get the men down on Azlaroc again as safe and free as tourists. All these requirements for the suits were difficult, but not unreasonable, not after men had voyaged in space for thousands of years and had the knowledge gained in all that time to draw upon. As in all of his affairs, Ramachandra did his best to maintain secrecy. He wanted no gaping crowds to follow him across the desert and behold his immersion in the trench. Callisto was to announce the adventurer's departure after it had been accomplished, and in half a year the ships routinely passing in and out from Azlaroc would be alerted to begin looking for their signals in space, that they might possibly be picked up there without having to get back down to the surface on their own. Also, perhaps his employer had business or personal reasons for secrecy at this point. Sorokin never learned. For himself, it did not matter. He realized that among the people he knew fairly well on Azlaroc, there was no one whom he felt compelled to notify of what he was about to attempt. And the people outside, the people he knew elsewhere in the galaxy, the ones he had long ago despaired of ever seeing again, well, they would be changed by now, of course. People out there aged faster. Time enough to notify them when he was out, was free again. The two of them, Ramachandra and Sorokin, headed west across the desert from the city in a flying machine, some weeks after Sorokin's new employment had begun. Already in the vehicle when they boarded it, besides their bulky armor and a few small items, was a shape covered by cloth and as big as a sizable table. Ramachandra said nothing about it, and Sorokin did not ask. The most dustless, trackless plain unrolled behind them as their flyer hurtled westward under the low sky at a speed that rapidly mounted to thousands of kilometers per hour. Automatic baffles ran out on its airfoils to deaden the shock wave it dredged along the narrow space between the land and sky. Callisto had remained behind, in the city. Spaceships near, refusing to take the chance of being marooned on Azlaroc by a possible early falling of the Veil. She remained in television contact with Ramachandra as he flew, briefing him on the results of last-minute tests on the armor and the results of her latest calculations. The three principal bodies in the Azlaroc system were approaching nearly the same relative positions they had been when the surviving recorder was carried down into the trench by a robot. "And be sure to send some dead mass of a few hundred kilograms ahead of you," Callisto cautioned. "I know I told you that before, but I reiterate because it seems to be very important. Did you provide yourself with something?" "I did." Ramachandra glanced once over his shoulder at the massive slab with a draped, uneven upper surface that rode behind them in the cabin. "It won't be long now. I think I see black sky ahead." Only unusual wanderers like Sorokin ever came this far across the plains. There was no physical reason why men could not live in sight of the black sky, or even live directly under it if they brought lights of their own. The air and temperature beneath it were the same as those beneath the sky of light. But psychologically, to live under black sky seemed to be practically impossible. Imagine the darkest, most ominous thunderstorm of Earth. Imagine the totality of Sol's eclipse and the deepest night beneath a cloud of poisonous volcanic ash. Multiply the effect of terror by whatever factor will overload your nerves. Thus, the black sky cutting off about half of Azlaroc's vast surface from the use of men. Once, in a period of something akin to suicidal madness, Sorokin had journeyed toward it and under it, first in a wheeled vehicle that took days to race him this far across the plains, then by foot, his vehicle left waiting, open-doored in the lifeless and silent wilderness where no one was going to come along to bother it. He had kept repeating to himself that there was nothing in or under black sky that would be intrinsically harmful or especially dangerous. What looked like terrible cloud was only a failure, for various well-understood reasons, of the radiation that otherwise caused the sky of Azlaroc to give the impression of yellow and mildly overcast daylight. Black sky was barely in sight ahead of him when he stopped the vehicle, but it seemed to leap closer with every stride as he began to walk toward it. He had no light with him. He had no light. He kept on walking until the appalling pall of it was up to his zenith, stretching to his right and left in a fuzzy boundary of mild collision with the living glow. And then he faced on into the dark and walked some more. He was terrified and didn't understand why he was making himself do this. Through sheer fascination with his own terror and the knowledge that he could go back. Yes, he could turn around at any time. The faint, diffuse bandwork on his own shadow strode ahead of him, cast by the light of living sky behind. But beyond a short distance ahead, he could see nothing. He moved beyond terror to something else. He walked thus for a distance that under ordinary circumstances would have exhausted him, stumbling over the smaller spheres and pyramids of the landscape when the light grew too bad to see at all. For a long time he was afraid to turn back and see how far he was getting from the light. When at last he turned, there seemed hardly more than a sliver of brightness along the base of the eastern sky. It was enough. He had satisfied whatever demon had driven him to this remote edge of the humanly habitable. Now almost relaxed and able to feel his exhaustion, he walked toward the light. After a while, as the light grew high in the sky again, some feeling of terror returned, and he had to run with the pressure of the night behind him, as if it could pursue him. Now in the flyer, he and Ramachandra didn't need to go under black sky to reach the subduction trench. Sorokin supposed it would have made no difference whatever to Ramachandra if they had. Why should it, to a man who was willing to try the surface of the neutron star? They landed within a few score meters of the trench, and with the help of powered hand lifters soon emptied the vehicle of all their gear, including the great slab, which Sorokin discovered now was stone. Not the beaten, homogenized world stuff of Azlaroc, matter with all the light seemingly knocked out of it, but textured, beautiful material from somewhere out in the broad cosmos. It was white stone marbled with subtle veins and streaks of varying shades of brown, and when Ramachandra casually pulled the covers aside, Sorokin saw that the stone was carved in the form of a gison, a mortuary sculpture somewhat larger than life, depicting a man and woman supine in death, their lightly draped bodies both of heroic mold. The man was Ramachandra, the woman unknown to Sorokin, but beautiful. Ramachandra treated the statuary as if it were any other mass of a few hundred kilograms about to be used as a kind of ballast. With Sorokin's help, he positioned it near the lip of the purple-floored subduction trench. As soon as it was settled on the ground, it began to creep perceptibly toward the place where it was going to disappear. "Let's get the suits on," Ramachandra said. He was watching his partner closely now, as if he thought some last-minute reluctance possible. But Sorokin was moving to get ready. "So you are using that," Callisto said from the television screen. Her eyes appeared to be turned toward the gison. Its stone had evidently been brought to Azlaroc within a few years of Sorokin's own arrival, for he could see the details of the carving with almost perfect clarity. Ramachandra grunted. "Any reason why we shouldn't use this?" "From my scientific point of view, no." "You said heavy stone would be ideal. All right, Callisto, we're just leaving the flyer here. When you make your announcement of our departure, you can send someone to get it, or do as you like." "I'll see that it's picked up, Ramachandra. You have about 1 minute to stand in the trench. Time to get into the suits." The suits were giant-sized on the outside, with servo-powered mechanical limbs. The internal space for the wearer, or occupant, was well protected and relatively small. They got into the suits, and then it was indubitably time to go. The huge sculpture had tipped on end into the trench, and the man and woman were going down side by side, head first, looking ludicrous rather than heroic now, with their giant marble feet sticking up into the air. As Sorokin watched, the stone seemed to accelerate in its downward passage, like a doomed ship sinking into water. Looking at each other steadily, the two men marched to the trench and stepped into it with their mechanical feet. "Do you feel fear, Wanderer?" "No more than you do, man of power." "I think I have guessed right about you, Sorokin. You are going toward the same goal that I am, but for different reasons." "Well, according to our agreement, my pay continues until this is over." It was the first time that Sorokin had heard his employer laugh. "Very well. Until you are back on the surface of Azlaroc, one way or another. See to it, Callisto." "Very well, sir." The stone carving was now completely gone. The lips of the trench made a grating sound as they sagged closed again above it. Ramachandra's suit was now submerged to its knees, and Sorokin was in somewhat deeper. He had no unusual sensations so far, but it was disconcerting and at the same time rather elating to realize that he was going to lead the way. Now, the level of the trench's bottom reached his suit's crotch. The last moment at which he might have changed his mind and scrambled out had probably gone by. But it was all right. For the immediate future, his suit was very probably capable of protecting him, and beyond that he did not try to think. He was sinking faster. Ramachandra looked down with apparent irritation at being made a follower. Sorokin, I would suggest you close yourself with Chronotran before imprisonment in the rock. It wasn't really rock, of course, and here for the first time Sorokin thought he had caught his employer in an error brought on by nervousness. Has bored you, seriously. The experts say the drug is more effective when taken before the time of real need. I'll take some soon, then. Thank you for the suggestion. See you down below, or up above. If either Ramachandra or Callisto had any more advice for him just then, he could not hear it. The purplish bottom of the trench flowed up like water around his faceplate, and he was going down. Only a few moments later, when it came to him that this was just the kind of darkness he would have experienced out at the nadir of Black Sky, did fear begin to take hold of him. With a curling of his limbs, he brought himself entirely inside the central chamber of his suit, and then he took some Chronotran. The drug did not kill fear, but gave one control over the subjective sense of time. Moments of joy or tranquility might be tremendously prolonged, while times of dreary boredom or pain could be as much compressed. It seemed to Sorokin that the blackness around his suit and the sense of overwhelming pressure whenever he tried to use its servo-powered limbs lasted only a little while. Never mind that the figures on his trip recorder added up to scores of days, or that his body went again and again through routines necessary to maintain health. Almost before he had time to anticipate a change was around him in the form of the same bands of blue-white radiance that he had seen in the hologram. A glance at instruments showed him that the pressure and the radiation flux outside his suit had both climbed enormously. He was surprised to see that the temperature, so far at least, was going down. He gave himself the antidote for Chronotran, wanting to be ready for action when required. Shortly afterward, he caught sight of the Gisant moving ahead of him through blue-white space in the direction from which the transverse bands of light seemed to flow. Spinning very slowly as it moved, it trailed something like a shock wave within the boundaries of which his suit of armor rode. Working the suit's legs and arms again, he found he could maneuver amid this medium of light like a swimmer in thick water. Turning his suit with paddling motions, he saw another like it, Ramachandra's, come tumbling slowly after him from the direction in which the bands of light marched off to disappear. One thing that surprised Sorokin was that he continued to maintain an up and down, not only as a matter of visual orientation, but as if his suit had an actual artificial gravity of its own, like a large spaceship, down being permanently toward its feet. Ramachandra had discussed the suit's systems with him thoroughly, and no artificial gravity had been mentioned. It must, therefore, be some effect of the environment. The speeding bluish stripes of light that formed his visual world were now repeating the sequence Sorokin had witnessed in the hologram, narrowing and widening with what seemed to be different layers of stripes, making moire patterns that had not been visible in the recording, patterns that jarred and jumped with each measured gigantic heartthrob of the pulsar. And now, with somehow unexpected suddenness, the singular contraction came to pinch his whole world down to a mere point of light. By all the Veils! Sorokin was standing upon the starry universe of bluish arcs and holding the neutron star above his head. Then he realized that he had come out onto the star's surface upside down, while the gravity inside his suit maintained its orientation toward his feet. He moved his arms and legs and tipped the world around him until his feet were down, wrapped and shielded within all 40 million Veils of Azlaroc. He stood untouched, unharmed, upon the spinning pulsar's surface. In a moment, he understood that he had been brought to one of the poles of its rotation, for the star circles lay all parallel to the horizon. A few paces away, the Gisant drifted almost buoyantly, only one corner of it dragging on the mirror surface that was a neutron solid with billions of times the rigidity of steel. The surface was seemingly as smooth as if machined, all the way out to the horizon. The highest mountain on the star should be just big enough for a man to stub his toe on it and trip, and to climb that mountain, to move a human's mass upward a few centimeters in this gravity, should take a lifetime's effort from a long-lived Azerocian settler. Not that a human should be standing here at all. If the tidal forces did not shred him into atoms, and the gravity haul his particles indistinguishably into the proton mass, then the electrical forces generated within the spinning superfluid core should blast him outward as a cloud of X-rays, melded with the pulsar's searchlight beam of radiation as focused by its incredible magnetic field. Ramachandra was coming toward him over the surface now, suit enclosed in a vaguely visible, transparent bubble, walking like a man underwater or in low gravity as he worked inside his suit with the instruments that were supposed to find the fold in their year veil. His lips were moving, but no sound or signal came through the multiplex communication system to Sorokin. "I can't hear you," he said when Ramachandra looked at him and lip-read the other's answer. "Nor I you." Ramachandra turned away then, briefly, and approached the sculpture, which was also enclosed in an almost imperceptible bubble of some force. When he reached out one of his suit's metallic hands toward the carven woman, the entire Gisant with its bubble instantaneously disappeared at the first touch. Part of Ramachandra's suit hand vanished at the same moment, and from the metal stump there sprang a sudden glow, more intense than any of the flares that occasionally appeared on the surrounding surface of the star. The brightness of the flaring metal, which was probably undergoing some thermonuclear reaction, slowly declined. Now bearing a coruscating firework in one hand, Ramachandra turned imperturbably back to Sorokin. "Don't try to touch helmets for communication," he mouthed. "I won't. What are your plans now?" "The fold isn't here, so I'm going on. The black hole will be rising soon, and I intend to follow the lines of force of the Veils in its direction. It seems the suit's drive will easily carry me. Whatever kind of balance of forces we're riding here." Nearby, the star flared, brighter than before. Then again far off, then farther still, and yet again beyond the near horizon. A shudder of the starscape came and went, that Sorokin saw but could not feel. Perhaps a quake had brought a mountain down and speeded up the pulsar's rotation by some fraction of a microsecond. "I'm not going on, Ramachandra. Not into a black hole, even if we can survive here," Sorokin ended with a gesture of hopeless pessimism. I know you're not. My second reason for bringing you along. All I ask is that you take back word of what you see me do. You need only wait here a few more minutes, and the forces that brought us here will bear you back again, to somewhere on Azlaroc. If you're lucky, you'll survive. Ramachandra smiled. And collect your pay. Sorokin could think of nothing to say. An impassable gulf had opened between him and the other man. Ramachandra was consulting his instruments. Black holes rising now. He nodded in the direction over Sorokin's shoulder, but when Sorokin turned, he found that the ultimate abyss offered almost nothing to see. Maybe a momentary squiggle in the blue arcs of one or two stars. If Ramachandra had had anything more to say, Sorokin had missed it. He stood watching now as the other man's suit, moving now under its own power, rose past him. No, there were some last words coming after all, for Ramachandra delayed enough to turn. If I go into it for good, yes? Well, I'll be joined by quite a crowd eventually. That's all. The holes are going to coalesce and eat the rest of the universe, you know, in a few billion years. His suit was soon out of sight amid the star streaks of the sky. 4 minutes later, the return tide came and bore Sorokin into the striped space of blue light that bent abnormally between the worlds. Then, do you think he actually went into it? Militus Milbray asked. He had some time ago forgotten cautious incredulity and was asking questions without hesitation. Sorokin drained a drink and gestured for another. I think he went on into it, yes, unless he found a folded edge of veils before he got that far. My recorder's in my suit outside. I don't know how much it'll show in support of what I say, but the suit is working fine. It carried me back to town from Ruler Ridge. This is my first stop. I've got to find Callisto. I thought she was going to have some kind of watch posted along Ruler Ridge in case either of us came back that way. You were with him, with Ramachandra, said a woman who had come into the place sometime during Sorokin's recital. And this is your first stop, coming back. He looked over at her. Yes. The rest of the people were attentively silent. Then you don't know. He started 2 questions and aborted them both before they reached his lips. Then he said, Ramachandra's back. For almost 10 days now. But there was more to be told. Callisto and her group won't let out much information, a man offered. But it's known that they dug something out of the ridge 10 days ago, and supposedly it has been at least tentatively identified as him. His suit, at least, presumably with him inside, enlarged somehow, and holding what looks like a small bright light in one hand. Dead? The woman made a gesture difficult to read. I've heard there's movement. Life, perhaps, but wrapped in a loop of 49 times 49, 2,401 veils. Sorokin said eventually, He'll go again. To mark the year on Azlaroc. They had been quarreling in the ship, and were still at it when they disembarked and left its sprawling metal complexities behind them. Ilana snapped at Hagen. So what if I misplaced your camera? What does it matter if you have one more picture of the stars? You can take a dozen when we depart. And when it turned out that they had missed the ground transport machine that was taking the other passengers across the smooth undulations of the gold plain toward the city, Hagen was almost expecting her to physically attack him. "Son of a nobody!" Ilana hissed. "Where are we to stay if you have made no reservations?" A kilometer away was the only real city on the star. Hagen realized that to one coming to Azlaroc for the first time, the city must look quite small. On the surface there appeared only a few fairyland towers, and little evidence of the many chambers and passageways dug out beneath the plain. "I haven't made up my mind where to stay." He turned away from her and began to walk after the transport machine. She followed. "You can never make up your mind about anything." It was an old, intermittent quarrel. If the reservations had been in perfect order, there would have been something else to quarrel about. She nagged him for 100 meters across the plain, and then the scenery began to come through to her. The enormous golden yellow land was humped here and there by paraboloid hills and studded with balanced spheres of matter. The surface looked more like something man-made than like soil, and it stretched in places up to the low, yellowish, sunless sky in asymptotic spires that broke off in radiant glory at an altitude of a few hundred meters at the upper edge of the region of gravity inversion. "What's that?" Her voice was no longer angry. She was looking toward the top of a golden sphere which loomed over the distanceless horizon, at right angles to the way they were walking. The sphere reminded Hagen of a large planet rising, as seen from some close-in satellite, but this sphere was entirely beneath the low, peculiar sky. "Only part of the topography." He remained calm, as usual, taking her bickering in stride. When they had gotten undersurface in the city and arranged for lodgings and were on their way to them through one of the smaller side passageways, Hagen saw some man or woman of a long past year approaching through the passage from the other direction. Had there been 3 or 4 people of the present year or of recent years in the same part of the corridor just then, the passage of such an old one would have been almost unnoticeable. The old one did not appear as a plain, solid human figure, only a disturbance in the air and along the wall, a mound of shadows and moire patterns that throbbed with the beat of the pulsar somewhere beneath their feet. The disturbance occupied hardly any space in this year's corridor, and Ilana at first was not aware of it at all. Hagen reached out a hand and took her by the upper arm and forced her, strong woman that she was, into 3 almost dancing steps that left her facing in the proper way to see. "Look, one of the early settlers." With a small intake of breath, Ilana fixed her eyes on the figure. She watched it out of sight around a corner, then turned her elfin face to Hagen. Her eyes had been enlarged and her naturally small chin further diminished in accordance with the fashion dictates of the time, even as Hagen's dark eyebrows had been grown into a ring of hair that crossed above his nose and went down by its sides to meld with his mustache. She said, "Perhaps one of the very first? An explorer?" "No." He looked about the ordinary overhead lights, the smooth walls of the yellowish rock-like substance of the star. "I remember that this corridor was not cut by the explorers, not perhaps until T20 or T30, so no settler in it can be older than that, of course." "I don't understand, Hagen. Why didn't you tell me more about this place before you brought me here?" "This way it will all come as a wonderful surprise." They met others in the corridor as they proceeded. Here came a couple of evidently 10 or 15 local years ago, walking in the nudity that had been acceptable as fashion then, draped with 10 or 15 of the sealing veils of Azlaroc so that their bodies shimmered slightly as they moved, giving off small diamond sparkles of light. The veils of only 10 or 15 years were not enough to warp a settler out of phase with this year's visitors, so the 4 people meeting in the passage had to give way a little on both sides, as if they were in a full sense contemporaries, and, like contemporaries, they excused themselves with vacant little social smiles. Numbers, glowing softly from the corridor walls, guided Hagen and Ilana to their rooms. "Hagen, what is this other sign that one sees on the walls?" It was a red hollow circle with a small pie-cut wedge of its interior filled with red also. The amount of red inside shows the estimated fraction of a year remaining until the next veil falls. Then there is not much of the year left for sightseeing. Here, this must be our door. I would say we have come at a poor time. Opening the door, he did not reply. Their baggage had already been deposited inside. "I wouldn't want to be trapped here, Hagen. Well, the apartment's not bad. Now what's the matter? What have I said?" She had learned to know at once when something really bothered him, which her inconsequential bickering rarely seemed to do. "Nothing. Ample warning is always given so the tourists can get away. You needn't worry." She was in the bedroom unpacking when something came in through the illusory window that seemed to give upon the golden plain. Where a sawtooth range of diminishing pyramids marched in from the horizon, there came a shimmer and a sliding distortion that was in the room with her before she knew it, that passed on harmless through her own flesh and went its way. She gave a yelp of fear. Hagen was in the doorway, smiling faintly. "Didn't I mention that we might be sharing our apartment here?" "Sharing? Of course not. Oh, you mean with settlers, folk of other years. But that's what it was then. But through the wall? That wall was evidently an open passage in their time. Ignore them, as they will us. Looking up through their veils, they can see us. Differently, too. While diving, I have asked them to describe how we look to them, but their answers are hard to understand." "Tell me about diving," she said, when they had finished settling in and were coming out of doors again. "Better than that. I'll show you. But I'll tell you first, of course." As they walked out onto the plain, Hagen could hear the pulsar component of the triple system beating as sound, the sound coming now from overhead, thick and soft and at 1/3 the speed of a calm human heart. It came through all the strangenesses of space that lay between him and the invisible pulsar that locked its orbit intricately with those of a small black hole and of the world called Azlaroc. He said, "What is called diving on Azlaroc is a means of approaching the people and things that lie under the veils of the years. Nothing can pierce the veils, of course, but diving stretches them, lets one get near enough to the people of the past to see them more clearly and make photographs. And more than that, oh gods of space." But Hagen said no more. On the plain, other tourists were also walking, in this year's fashion of scanty garments, each of 100 colors, in the mild, calm air under the vague yellowish sky that was not really a sky, and bathed in sunless light. Hagen had almost the feeling of being still indoors. He was heading for a diver's shop that he remembered. He meant to waste no time in beginning his private search in earnest. Ilana walked beside him, no longer quarrelsome and increasingly interested in the world around them. "You say nothing at all can pierce the veils once they have fallen in and wrapped themselves about this planet?" "No matter can pierce them. And this is not a planet. I suppose star is the best term for a layperson to use. though the scientists might wince at it. There's the diver's shop ahead. See that sign beside the cave? The cave was in the side of a sharp-angled rhombic hill. Inside the shop they were greeted by the proprietor, a settler swathed in more than 100 veils who needed electronic amplifiers to converse with customers. After brief negotiation, he began to take their measurements. "Ilana, when we dive, what would you like to see?" Now she was cheerful. "Things of beauty. Also, I would like to meet one of those first stranded explorers." "The beauty will be all about. There are signals and machines to guide the tourist to exceptional sights. As for the explorer, we can try. When I was last here, it was still possible to dive near enough to them to see their faces and converse. Maybe now, when 130 more veils have been added, it is possible no longer." They were fitted with diving gear, each a carapace and helm of glass and metal that flowed like water over their upper bodies. "Hagen, if nothing can pierce the fallen veils of the years, how are these underground rooms dug out?" Now his diver's suit had firmed into place. Where Hagen's face had been, she saw only a distorting mirror that gave an eerie semblance of her own face back to her. But his voice was familiar and reassuring. "Digging is possible because there are two kinds of matter, of physical reality, here coexisting. The stuff of the landscape, all those mathematical shapes, and the plane they rise from is comparatively common matter. Its atoms are docile and workable, at least here in this region of mild gravity and pressure. The explorers realized from the start that this mild region needed only air and water and food to provide men with more habitable surface than a planet. But there, your diver's gear is stabilized about you. Let's walk to Old Town, where we may find an explorer." Sometimes above ground and sometimes below, they walked, armored in the strange suits and connected to the year of their own visit by umbilical cables as fine and flexible and unbreakable as artists' lines on paper. Adjusting his gear for maximum admittance, Hagen nervously scanned the faces of all passing settlers. Now some features were discernible in even the oldest of them. "And the other kind of matter, Hagen, the other physical reality? What about the veils?" "Ah, yes, the material between the stars, gathered up as this triple system advances through space. What is not sucked into the black hole is sieved through nets of the pulsar's radiation, squeezed by the black hole's 100 billion gravities, shattered and transformed in all its particles as it falls toward Azlaroc, through the belts of space that starships must avoid. Once every systemic year, conditions are right and a veil falls. What falls is no longer matter that men can work with, any more than they can work in the heart of a black hole. Ilana, are you tuned to maximum? Look just ahead." They were out on the surface again. A human figure that, even with the help of diver's gear, appeared no more than a wavery half-image had just separated itself from an equally insubstantial dwelling. 130 years before, someone had pointed out a similar half-visible structure to Hagen as an explorer's house. He had never spoken to an explorer, but he was ready now to try. He began to run. The gear he wore was only a slight hindrance. Close ahead now was the horizon, with just beyond it the golden globe they had earlier observed. No telling how far away it was, 1,000 meters or perhaps 10 times that distance. Amid glowing dunes, here the color of the land was changing from yellow to a pink so subtle that it was effectively a new color. Hagen thought that he had lost the explorer, but then suddenly the wavery stick figure was in his path. Almost he ran through or collided with it. He regained his balance and tried to speak casually. "Honorable person, we do not wish to be discourteous, and we will leave you if our inquiries are bothersome, but we would like to know if you are one of the original explorers." Eyes that one moment looked like skeletal sockets, and the next as large and human as Ilana's own, regarded Hagen. Or were they eyes at all? Working with the controls of his sensory input, he gained for one instant a glimpse of a face, human but doubtfully either male or female, squinting and intense, hair blown about as if in a terrible wind. It faced Hagen and tried to speak, but whatever words came seemed to be blown away. A moment later, the figure was gone, only walking somewhere nearby, but so out of focus that it might as well have flown behind the golden sphere somewhere. Question or answer, Hagen? Which had it offered you? Ilana's hands clamped on his arm. "Hagen, I saw. It was terrible." "No, it wasn't. Only a man or a woman. What lies between us and them, that can be terrible sometimes." Ilana was dialing her admittance down, going out of focus in a different way. Hagen adjusted his controls to return fully with her to their own year. Very little of the land around them seemed to change as they did so. A chain of small pink hills, hyperbolic paraboloid saddles precisely separating members, seemed to grow up out of nothing in the middle distance. That was all. "Hagen, that was an explorer. That must have been. I wish he had talked to us, even though he frightened me. Are they still sane?" He looked around, out over the uninhabited region toward which they had been walking, then back toward the city. In the city was where he would have to search. He said, "The first veil that men ever saw falling here caught them totally by surprise. They described it as looking like a fine net settling toward them from an exploding sky. It settled over the first explorers and bound itself to the atoms of their bodies. They are all here yet, as you know. Soon it was realized that the trapped people were continuing to lead reasonable human lives, and that they were now protected against aging far better than we on the outside. There's nothing so terrible about life here. Why shouldn't they be sane? Many others have come here voluntarily to settle. Nothing I've seen so far would lead me to do that." Her voice was growing petulant again. "Ilana, maybe it will be better if we separate for a time. This world is as safe as any. Wander and surprise yourself. And you, Hagen? I will wander too." He had been separated from Ilana for a quarter of a day and searching steadily all the time before he finally found her. Mira. He came upon her in a place that he knew she frequented, or had frequented, 130 years before. It was one of the lower subterranean corridors leading to a huge pool in which real water diving, swimming, and other splashy sports were practiced. He was approaching her from the rear in the corridor when she suddenly stopped walking and turned her head, as if she knew he was there even before she saw him. "I knew you would be back, Hagen," she said as he came up. "Mira," he said, and then was silent for a time. Then he said, "You are still as beautiful as ever." "Of course." They both smiled, knowing that here she could not age, and that change from any sort of accident was most unlikely. He said, "I knew that, but now I see it for myself." Even without his diving gear, he could have seen enough through 130 veils to reassure himself of that. But with his gear on, it was almost as if he were really in her world. The two of them might hold hands, or kiss, or embrace in the old way that men and women still used as in the time when the race was born of women's bodies. But at the same time, it was impossible to forget that the silken and impermeable veils of 130 years would always lie between them, and that never again in this world or any other would they touch. I knew you would come back, but why did you stay away so long? A few years make but little difference in how close I can come to you. She put out her hands and held him by the upper arms and stroked his arms. He could feel her touch as if through layers of the finest ancient silk. But each year made a difference to me. I thought you had forgotten me. Remember the vows about eternity that we once made? I thought I might forget, but I did not. I found I couldn't. 130 years ago, he and Mira had quarreled while visiting Azlaroc as tourists. Angry, Hagen had gone off-star without telling her when an alarm sounded that the yearly veil was falling early. She had been sure that he was still somewhere on the surface and had remained on it herself, searching for him. By the time he came back, meaning to patch up the quarrel, the veil had already fallen. She had not changed, and yet seeing her again was not all that he had expected it to be. The reaction to his coming back was growing in her. Hagen, it is you, really you. He felt embarrassed. Can you forgive me for what happened? Of course I can, darling. Come, walk with me. Tell me of yourself and what you've done. Later I will try to tell you. How could he relate, in a moment or two, the history of 130 years? What have you done here, Mira? How is it with you? How would it be? She gestured in an old, remembered way, with a little sensuous, unconscious movement of her shoulder. You lived here with me. You know how it is. I lived here only a very little time. But there are no physical changes worth mentioning. The air my year group breathes and the food we eat are recycled forever, more hours than the rooms we live in are. But still we change and grow, though not in body. We explore the infinite possibilities of each other and of our world. There are only 1,106 in my year group, and we have as much room here as do the billions on a planet. I feared that perhaps you had forgotten me. Can I forget where I am and how I came to be here? Her eyes grew very wide and luminous, not enlarged eyes like Ilana's. Mira, like most other settlers, had kept to the fashions of her year of veiling, and there was a compressed fierceness in her lips. There was a time when I raged at you, but no longer. There is no point. He said, You're going to have to teach me how to be a settler here, how to put up with gawking tourists and with the physical restrictions on which rooms and passages I may enter when more of them are dug out in the future. Do you never want to burrow into the rooms and halls of later years and make them your own? That would just cause destruction and disruption for the people of later years to try to mend. They could probably retaliate by diving against us and somehow disarranging our lives, though I suppose a war between us would be impossible. Do I disarrange your life seriously, Mira, by diving to you now? Hagen! She shook her head reprovingly. Of course you do. How can you ask? She looked at him more closely. Is it really you who has come back, or someone else with outlandish eyebrows? Then the wild and daring look he knew and loved came over her, and suddenly the 130 years were gone. Come to the pool and the beach, and we will soon see who you really are. He ran laughing in pursuit of her. She led him to the vast underground grotto of blackness and fire, where she threw off her garments and plunged into the pool. He followed, lightly burdened with his diver's gear. It was an old running, diving, swimming game between them, and he had not forgotten how to play. With the gear on, Hagen, of course, did not need to come to the surface of the pool to breathe, nor was he bothered by the water's cold. But still she beat him, flashing and gliding and sliding away. He was both outmaneuvered and outsped. Laughing, she swam back to where he had collapsed in gasps and laughter on the black and golden beach. "Hagen, have you aged that much? Even wearing the drag and weight of diver's gear myself, I could beat you today." Was he really that much older? Lungs and heart should not wear out so fast, nor had they, he believed, but something else in him had aged and changed. "You have practiced much more than I," he grumbled. "But you were always the better diver," she told him softly, swimming near, then coming out of the water. Some of the droplets that wet her emerging body were water of her own year under the silken veils of time that gauzed her skin. Other drops, the water of Hagen's time, clung on outside the veils. "And the stronger swimmer. You will soon be beating me again if you come back." "I am back already, Mira. You are 3 times as beautiful as I remembered you." Mira came to him, and he pulled her down on the beach to embrace her with great joy. Why, he thought. Oh, why did I ever leave? Why indeed? He became aware that Ilana was swimming in the water nearby in her own diver's gear, watching, had perhaps been watching and listening for some time. He turned to speak to her, to offer some explanation and introduction, but she submerged and was gone. Mira gave no sign of having noticed the other woman's presence. "Do you miss the outside world, Mira?" "I suppose I drove you away to it the last time with my lamenting for it. But no, I do not really miss it now. This world is large enough and grows no smaller for me, as your world out there grows smaller as you age, for all its galaxies and space. Is it only the fear of time and age and death that has brought you back to me, Hagen?" "No." He thought his answer was perfectly honest, and the contrast between this perfectly honest statement and some of his earlier ones showed up the earlier ones for what they were. Who had he been trying to fool? Who was it that men always tried to fool? "And was it," she asked, "my lamenting that drove you off? I lament no longer for my life, nor for the veil that fell between us." The true answer was there in her grave eyes, if he could read it through the stretching, subtle, impenetrable veils. The red circles held narrow dagger blades of urgent warning on all the walls, and warning voices boomed like thunder across the golden, convoluted plain. The evacuation ship lay like a thick pool of bright and melted-looking metal in the field, with its 100 doors open for quick access, and 100 machines carrying tourists and their baggage aboard. The veil was falling early again this year. Stretching in a row across the gravity inversion sky near one side of the directionless horizon, explosions already raged like an advancing line of silent summer thunderstorms. Hagen, hurrying out onto the field, stopped a hurrying machine. "My companion, the woman, Ilana, is she aboard the ship?" "No list of names of those aboard has been compiled, man." The timbre of the metal voice was meant to be masterly and reassuring even when the words were not. Hagen looked around him at the surface of the city, the few spare towers, and the multitudinous burrowed entrances. Over the whole nearby landscape, more machines were racing to reach the ship with goods or perhaps even tourists who had somehow not gotten the warning in comfortable time, or who were at the last moment changing their minds about becoming settlers. Was not Ilana frantically looking amid the burrows for Hagen? looking in vain as the last moments fell. It was against logic and sense that she should be, but he could not escape the feeling that she was. Nevertheless, the doors on the ship were closed, or closing, now. "Take me aboard," he barked at the machine. "At once, man." And they were already flying across the plain. Aboard ship, Hagen looked out of port as they were hurled into the sky, then warped through the sideward modes of space, twisted out from under the falling veil before it could clamp its immovable knots about the atoms of the ship and passengers and hold them down forever. There was a last glimpse of the yellow plain, and then only strange flickers of light from the abnormal space they were traversing briefly, like a cloud. "That was exciting!" Out of nowhere, Ilana threw herself against him with a hug. "I was worried there for a moment that you'd been left behind." She was ready now to forgive him a flirtation with a girl of 130 years ago. It was nice that he was forgiven, and Hagen patted her shoulder, but his eyes were still looking upward and outward, waiting for the stars.